The rain had already started when Ivy pulled into the circular driveway. The wipers dragged back and forth, slow and rhythmic, as if marking time for something final. I sat in the passenger seat, clutching my coat, the one with the missing button, watching the pale brick building rise ahead of us. The sign by the entrance read, Rosewood Rehabilitation and Wellness Center, too cheerful a name for what it really was. "I promise this is temporary," Ivy said, slipping the car into park. Her voice had that brightness she used when she wanted to end a conversation before it began. "You'll get a few days of rest. They'll help you with meals and medication. It'll be good for you." I turned toward her. "I don't need a facility to feed me soup, Ivy. I need my home." She smiled without meeting my eyes and reached for her purse. "You're not dying, Mom. You're just inconvenient." The word landed between us like a slap. Before I could speak, she was out of the car, running toward the sliding glass doors, where a woman in scrubs waited with a clipboard. I stayed seated, rain tapping the window, my breath clouding the glass. The nurse opened my door and spoke in the kind, practiced tone people use for children. "Let's get you inside, Mrs. Ward. Your daughter has handled all the paperwork." Inside, everything smelled of disinfectant and lemon polish. The hallway stretched long and pale, lined with open doors that revealed narrow beds and plastic flowers. I tried to find Ivy through the glass panel near the entrance, but she was already in the driver's seat, phone to her ear. The car rolled away before I could raise my hand. The nurse led me to a small room with a single dresser and a bed pressed against the wall. "You'll be comfortable here," she said, placing a clipboard on the nightstand. I sat down the mattress, sinking under my weight. My hands trembled as I reached for my bag, but it wasn't there. My purse, my phone, my house keys, everything I owned were gone. The morning began with a knock and the sound of rubber soles on linoleum. A nurse I hadn't seen before wheeled in a tray with lukewarm oatmeal and a small cup of pills I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Ward, time for your medication." I looked at the pills, then up at her. "I don't take anything except for the occasional ibuprofen." She glanced at the chart on her clipboard. "Your daughter listed a few things. Blood pressure, memory support. Just routine, nothing to worry about." "Memory support." I pushed the tray aside. "I'd like to speak with someone in charge." She hesitated. "You can make a request at the front desk during visitor hours." "I'm not a visitor," I said. "I live here now, apparently." The nurse offered a gentle smile. "Your daughter filled out the long-term care admission. You've been assigned for ongoing support." I stared at her, the room tilting slightly, not from dizziness, but from the sudden shift of reality. Long-term care. They had no plan to send me home. Later, I wandered into the communal area where a woman in a housecoat rocked in her chair, whispering to someone who wasn't there. Across the room, a man hummed a hymn I recognized from my childhood. The windows were large but smudged, looking out onto a patch of grass trimmed too neat to feel alive. One of the aides approached me with a blanket, gently tucking it around my shoulders. "Your daughter said you get confused sometimes, that you forget where you are." I didn't respond. I couldn't trust my voice not to break. That afternoon, I asked to borrow a pen and a notepad. The receptionist hesitated but handed them over. I sat by the window, scribbling names, addresses, numbers I remembered. Just weeks ago, I was reorganizing the travel section at the library, planning spring bulbs for my garden, dropping off banana bread at the shelter on 4th. Now I was here, reduced to a bed, a blanket, and someone else's description of who I was. That night, I watched my roommate murmur to the ceiling, her hands twitching under the covers, and I began to wonder how long it would take for them to forget I was different. I used to think exhaustion was a kind of proof. If I ended each day too tired to stand, then maybe I was doing something right. After my husband died in that highway accident, the house grew quiet in a way that felt alive, like grief had its own pulse. Ivy was 12 then, still too young to understand finality, too old to believe in comfort. I promised her that we would be all right, even when I wasn't sure I believed it. I took the morning shift at the library and the evening cataloging job at the university archive. The pay barely covered rent, but books became my refuge. The smell of paper, the order of it all. While the world outside kept unraveling, I could still file things alphabetically and pretend life obeyed a system. There were nights I skipped dinner so Ivy could have seconds. I told her I wasn't hungry, that I'd eaten earlier at work. She believed me because she wanted to. When she showed me her sketches, coffee cups, storefronts, people smiling through window panes, I saw the shape of her dream before she could name it. She wanted a cafe of her own filled with music and cinnamon and warmth. I told her she would have it. When art school tuition arrived, I sold my wedding band. The pawnbroker looked at me as if I were giving up something sacred. Maybe I was, but it bought her one more semester. That was enough. Years later, when she called to say she'd found a space in Seattle for her cafe, I wired what I had left my retirement savings, my cushion for later. I didn't tell her it was all of it. I wanted her to feel supported, not indebted. The day the cafe opened, Ivy sent a photo of the sign above the door. Hearth and Ivy. I cried in my kitchen, proud beyond words. I thought her success would be ours, a shared chapter built from everything I'd endured. Instead, it became the reason she decided she no longer needed me at all. 3 days passed before anyone remembered I had a voice. The nurses came and went with trays of food. I barely touched their smiles, as practiced as their footsteps. I asked for the phone each morning and was told it was being repaired or reserved for emergencies. By the 4th morning, I stopped asking politely. When they finally placed the handset in my hand, it felt heavier than I remembered. I dialed Ivy first. The line rang 6 times before switching to voicemail. I hung up and tried again. Then again. On the 3rd attempt, it went straight to silence. She'd blocked me. The air in the room thickened. I called the house phone next. A mechanical voice told me the number was no longer in service. I tried the bank, hoping for something ordinary, an error, a misunderstanding. The young clerk sounded cheerful, until I gave her my name. "Oh," she said softly. "Just a moment, ma'am." I listened to the faint tapping of keys and the long pause that followed. "It seems there were recent authorization updates," she said. "Your daughter is now listed as primary on the household and business accounts. I can't disclose more without her permission." My throat went dry. "And the mortgage." Another pause. "That property was refinanced last month. The deed lists a single owner now." I thanked her before she could finish. The receiver trembled in my hand as I replaced it. I sat on the bed until the hallway clock chimed each note, pressing deeper into my chest. That evening, I asked the nurse for paper and a pen. To journal, I said, smiling the way she expected me to. She seemed pleased and handed over a small notebook with a floral cover. Once she left, I drew a line down the center of the first page and wrote 2 headings: what they took and what's still mine. Underneath, I began listing every number, every name, every detail. I could remember the bank officer who handled the original mortgage, the lawyer who filed my husband's will, the old manager at the cafe who still sent Christmas cards. By the time the lights dimmed for the night, my hand ached. The list wasn't finished, but the plan had begun. On the 5th morning, the janitor came to fix the flickering light above my bed. He was a quiet man, middle-aged, with the kind of patience that comes from years of listening more than speaking. As he worked, he noticed the notepad on my nightstand. Pages filled edge to edge with my handwriting. "You keep records," he said. Tightening the bulb. "Old habit," I replied. "I used to manage library inventories. I like things to be in order." He smiled faintly. "I thought I recognized your name. My cousin works at Fremont Bank. She mentioned a customer with the same last name, said there was some mix-up with signatures on a loan document." I looked up sharply. What kind of loan? For a business expansion, I think. A cafe. She said the client, your daughter Wright, came in last month. Everyone said it was nice she was helping her mother handle the paperwork. They said you signed it together. The air in my chest went still. They said I signed. He nodded, uneasy. That's what I heard. I thanked him and waited until the door clicked shut. Then I opened my notebook to a fresh page and pressed my pen so hard the tip nearly tore through the paper. The anger didn't come as a rush. It arrived cold and deliberate, like a lens clicking into focus. If Ivy had forged my name once, she had likely done more. The accounts, the mortgage, the business, every detail lined up now like a puzzle I had been too trusting to solve. I turned back to the first page of my notes and drew a single line beneath the list. In careful print, I wrote, "If they think I'm confused, I'll let them learn what clear looks like." When the hallway grew quiet and the night nurse dimmed the lights, I reached for the phone on the bedside table. I dialed a number I hadn't used in more than 10 years, one I still knew by heart. Margot Kane. The voice on the line answered, brisk and steady. I took a breath. Margot, it's Clara Ward. I think my daughter just committed fraud in my name. She arrived the next afternoon just as the sun began to fall behind the west wing of the building. I saw her through the glass doors. Hair shorter stride, slower, but still wrapped in the no-nonsense presence that once made judges lean forward. Margot Kane hadn't changed much. Still wore tailored slacks, still carried her leather briefcase like it was loaded. She didn't greet me right away. She walked straight to the front desk, stated her name, and handed over a sheet of paper. "I'm Clara Ward's attorney of record," she said, effective immediately. There was a quiet flurry of confusion. Someone paged a supervisor. A nurse whispered. 10 minutes later, I was packing what little I had. No one stopped me. No one dared. We didn't talk much in the car. She handed me a bottle of water and a granola bar, and I accepted both like a soldier returning from the front. We drove past the city limits to a modest roadside motel with peeling paint and clean sheets. It wasn't much, but it was freedom. After I showered and changed into the clothes she'd bought at a nearby pharmacy, we sat across from each other at the small table near the window. She opened her briefcase, pulled out copies of the documents I'd sent the notebook scans. The account numbers, the forged loan application. "It's worse than I expected," she said, but she was sloppy. The mortgage was transferred illegally, and she may have frozen you out of the accounts, but the cafe's original business license still lists you as co-owner. That's our crack. I nodded, letting the pieces settle. "You still have power of revocation," she added. "We'll start there." I opened my notebook and began flipping pages. Everything was here, the dates, the signatures, the order of events. I hadn't been journaling. I'd been mapping a war. Margot leaned over to scan one of the lists. "You've already done half the work," she muttered. I turned to a fresh page and began writing out a timeline. Every lie Ivy told, every document altered, every name I still had access to. The rest of this wouldn't be survival. It would be strategy. By Monday morning, Margot had already filed the revocation of power of attorney. The injunction for the cafe accounts followed by noon. That afternoon, she submitted a formal petition to reverse the fraudulent property transfer Ivy had orchestrated behind my back. Each filing felt like a stone placed precisely where it belonged, calm, weighty, deliberate. We didn't talk about revenge. We talked about process. Margot had always been clinical like that. No flourishes, just facts. I followed her lead, watching how she assembled everything I had written into something sharp enough to hold up in court. The news broke before we expected. Ivy had scheduled a live interview with a local news station promoting a new wellness cafe initiative downtown. She wore a cream blazer, and that performative ease she saved for cameras, smiling as she spoke about female entrepreneurship, legacy, and community. Then someone off camera handed her an envelope. The smile faltered. She kept talking for a moment, eyes skimming the document, before her voice cracked mid-sentence. The host shifted awkwardly. The camera cut early. Margot didn't look up from her laptop. That would be the injunction. I said nothing. We didn't celebrate. We reviewed documents, double-checked timelines, prepared for the inevitable response. There would be calls, emails, pressure. But that night, none of them came. I stepped outside the motel and walked 2 blocks toward the neighborhood I once called mine. The houses still looked the same post-war bungalows with rose bushes and tired porches. My house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, just beyond the elm trees. The lights were on, curtains drawn. A soft glow spilled through the kitchen window, where I used to make Ivy's favorite Sunday stew. For a moment, I stood at the corner and watched the shadows move inside. I didn't know who they were now, her husband. Maybe some investor playing house. It no longer mattered. I turned back toward the motel, the sound of my steps steady on the pavement. Ivy had started this on paper, and now it would end the same way. The next morning, we would file for court enforcement. By the end of the week, the cafe's accounts were frozen. Payroll bounced, orders halted, and deliveries stopped arriving at the loading dock. Ivy must have spent days on the phone trying to salvage it, but banks don't negotiate with ghosts. The vendors began to post publicly small complaints that grew louder: unpaid invoices, false promises, missing checks. Someone leaked copies of contracts with my name signed in the wrong handwriting. Margot sent me updates each morning, factual and unembellished. Suppliers have terminated their agreements, she said one afternoon, scrolling through her tablet. 2 former employees filed claims with the Department of Labor. I nodded, but didn't feel triumph. The satisfaction I thought would come never arrived. It was just quiet, like a clock that had finally stopped ticking after years of being wound too tight. News sites picked up the story next, turning Ivy from an entrepreneur into a cautionary headline. Anonymous comments filled the internet, accusations, theories, sympathy that turned to scorn. I read none of it. I didn't need to. I had once taught her everything she needed to survive this world. I could still remember the day she came home from middle school, in tears, caught lying about a class project she hadn't finished. I made her rewrite the entire report from scratch, sitting beside me at the kitchen table until midnight. Integrity, I told her, spelling it out slowly so she would remember. It means doing the right thing even when no one is watching. She had looked up at me then, wide-eyed and contrite. That same word had now undone her. When Margot confirmed the settlement funds were cleared back into my account, I asked for a single withdrawal. I walked to the community center 3 blocks from the library, the same one where I used to run reading classes. I met the new director and quietly donated part of what I'd recovered. The funds would establish a small scholarship for women over 50 who wanted to return to work, start fresh, or learn something new. By the time I left the office, the paperwork was signed and the account was active. The rest of the plan would take care of itself. The court finalized the property enforcement without resistance. Ivy didn't contest the order. She didn't show up. Her silence arrived like a formality, one last transaction she couldn't rewrite. The house was listed and sold within 3 weeks. A young couple with 2 boys signed the closing papers, all wide smiles and weekend plans. I wished them well and left my keys on the kitchen counter next to a note that simply read, "Take care of the garden." With the proceeds, I made a quiet purchase, 1 street over, same block, just next door. A smaller cottage, narrow porch, faded shingles. I remembered the woman who used to live there. She grew peonies and left muffins on neighbors' steps. The house had sat empty for months. I bought it in cash. No fuss, no notice, no announcement. I moved in on a Wednesday. Margot helped carry boxes. I brought only what mattered: my books, My tea kettle, the old photo of Ivy at graduation. The rest stayed in storage. I planted roses along the fence line the first weekend. The soil was soft, easy to turn over. A few days later, as I watered the base of the new blooms, I heard a screen door creak open. I didn't look up right away. I let the moment come to me. When I turned, Ivy stood on her porch with a half-packed box in her hands. Her face was pale, drawn. She didn't speak. Neither did I. For a few seconds, we stared at each other across the thin slice of grass that once connected our lives. The silence between us was full of memory of choices of things that couldn't be taken back. I didn't offer a wave or a nod. I just turned back to the roses and continued watering. The next morning, her moving van pulled into the driveway. I watched it from the kitchen window the same way I once watched her play hopscotch on that sidewalk. She left before noon. No knock, no note, no goodbye. By afternoon, the house stood quiet, and I returned to my garden with no one watching. Weeks passed. The cafe never reopened. Ivy didn't make a statement, didn't host a farewell event, didn't leave a message in the window. One morning, a for lease sign appeared behind the glass, and by the end of the week, the furniture inside had vanished. No one asked where she'd gone. One neighbor said they saw her loading her car in the early hours. Trunk full, eyes down. I didn't ask. I didn't follow. Instead, I returned to the pieces of my life that still fit. I joined a reading circle at the library on Thursdays. On Mondays, I brought muffins to the volunteers at the shelter. My roses bloomed brighter this year, a red so deep it almost looked like velvet. I added a second row along the fence. Margot came by one afternoon with a folder in hand. Everything inside was signed, notarized, and organized, the trust finalized. The property would go to the local community foundation when I passed to be used as transitional housing for older women starting over. My savings, what was left, would seed a fund to support them. Groceries, classes, transportation, whatever they needed to begin again. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and opened my old notebook, the one I had filled with names and numbers, dates, and quiet rage. I flipped through the pages, slowly remembering who I was when I wrote them. Near the back, I found the first line I'd written after learning what Ivy had done. If they think I'm confused, I'll let them learn what clear looks like. I crossed out the word revenge scribbled beneath it. Above it, I wrote restoration. They say love means forgiveness. But what if forgiveness means learning to live without their apology? What does peace look like when silence is all that's left to share? I closed the notebook, slid it into the drawer, and let the quiet settle around me like a blanket I had chosen, not one handed to me by someone else.